Okay, I think we are live. So we have a couple of viewers already. So I will give people a little bit of a chance to get into it before I get, formally started. But we have a little bit of a unique setup today, and I think anyone who's been watching the last few episodes is aware of why. So we're going to go ahead and just get right into it. So, hello ladies and gentlemen of Vanderbilt and the entire YouTube world, and welcome to Terrier Talk Season 2, Episode 35. This is the mock draft special. There is a lot to go over with this. So first off, I've been talking about this for the last few weeks. There isn't really anything else within sports to talk about. There was the WNBA draft just about a week ago, but I don't really look at that very much. So really the only thing, I want this channel to go into college football and the NFL. Thank you. And also, I guess this acts as a confirmation, making sure, because with all this extra setup, that it is working. It hasn't worked in the past, so I think it is working, so that's great. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. So I want to get into college football and the NFL, but the only real news around this time of the year, really in any way, even whether or not the coronavirus is here at any year, is the NFL draft. It ties both college football and the NFL very well. The best players from the previous year that are draft eligible being picked and becoming the future of this next year, of the next year of the NFL and on from there. So it's a really exciting time. This is the first year that I've really gone deep into it to create, my own true full first round mock draft. So a few ground rules before we get right into it. So the big one, and it's the first question really to ask, there are two big questions, to ask when it comes to how a person's mock draft works. First off, are there going to be trades? And second off, what perspective are you looking at this from? I'll explain that in a minute. But first off, the trades. So there are two perspectives to look at. First off, there is the way to not have trades within your NFL draft, within your mock draft. If you're doing this is, sacrificing realism for the sake of simplicity, or you could have trades within your mock draft, which would sacrifice simplicity for the sake of realism. Putting trades within a mock draft, trades are going to happen within any NFL draft within the first round, within all 7 rounds. But trying to predict that is very difficult. So I chose not to have trades. I will, when we get to different picks, mention teams that, because the pick might not fit correctly, could definitely be trade down or maybe trade up potential partners or teams that would be looking for that. But I'm not going to predict or mock any specific trades within my mock draft. The other question is the way that you're looking at it with your mock draft. What I mean by that is, over the last few weeks, I've talked about what teams should be doing. This is, these are the needs for this team. These are the free agent moves that this team made, and this was good or bad because this is what this team should have done. Emphasis on that word, should. I've been talking about what were good moves, bad moves, things that teams should be doing. You could make your mock draft like that as well. This is what this team should do, and if they don't do this, it's a bad idea. I could have done that, but I decided to instead, again, for the sake of realism, and for what a true mock draft is, because it's really a prediction, I decided instead to make this mock draft based around what I think the team will do, ultimately. That, I think, is more accurate, and also it's a little bit different from what I've been doing previously. If you've been watching the past few weeks, you probably have a decent understanding of what I think these teams should be doing with the draft, what I think their biggest needs are, and where I think different players should be going. But that doesn't coincide with exactly what people think these teams will do, and what they probably will do. So I think it's more accurate and a little bit different to show exactly what I think will happen on draft night, obviously outside of trades. Trades will happen within the first round. This is only a 1-round mock draft, but trades will happen within the first round. I'm not going to discuss the trades I think will happen. Instead, I'll talk about the teams that I think are potential trade partners, either down or up. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it with the first pick. And the first pick, of course, is Cincinnati Bengals, and there is really no question with this first pick. I've talked about it for a few weeks. This is one of those picks where not only should the team do this, the team will most definitely do this, unless something very surprising happens within now and Thursday. The Cincinnati Bengals have one player that they have to be picking at this point. Andy Dalton's a free agent, and he was not inspiring confidence this past season after a 2-14 campaign. And so, because of that, there really is just one player that makes sense. From Ohio, went to Ohio State before transferring to LSU, of course. I'm talking about Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow isn't the best player in this draft class. Even coming, again, from an LSU fan, this, Louisiana, Vanderbilt, LSU fan, this is not the best player in this draft class. That's Chase Young, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. But even though he's only the second or maybe even third, who knows, best player in this class from overall value, being a quarterback means a lot in the NFL and within any draft, and you have to know that in order to make a mock draft. And this is true here. The Bengals need Joe Burrow. They need, not just for the value, because Joe Burrow is still an elite prospect. He still is one of the best prospects in this class. It's also where he comes from, who he is. There's a certain amount of swagger that comes with picking Joe Burrow, and Joe Burrow himself from this LSU campaign this past year, that season. Of course, 15-0, one of the best offensive seasons in the history of college football. That not picking Joe Burrow would be such a mistake that I feel like there is no way they don't do it. Unless they get an absolute shipload of picks from a Miami or maybe a Los Angeles. I don't see any other way for this really to go. And when I say Miami, I mean like 4 of their 6 picks in the top 2 rounds from this draft, plus some other stuff. It would have to be a lot to get that number 1 overall pick. Joe Burrow is such a slam dunk from Ohio to Ohio. Cincinnati Bengals, they have to get him at number 1. But, because of that, the Washington Redskins, picking at number 2, can go and scoop up the best player in the draft. Also from Ohio State player Chase Young. Joe Burrow will be the number 1 pick and should be the number 1 pick, but Chase Young is the best player in the draft. He is an absolute generational prospect. Talked about this last week. You can truly make comparisons to some of the great top 5 picks that were pass rushers in the past decade. Ndamukong Suh, Myles Garrett, Bradley Chubb. These players truly do compare to Chase Young. That is the sort of level he is. Von Miller, that Super Bowl ring, he was 2nd overall, just like I think Chase Young will be. A lot of rumors are floating about with the Washington Redskins going to get Tua Tagovailoa or Jeff Okudah or Derek Brown, probably not Derek Brown, or Isaiah Simmons, but it should be Chase Young. I think Chase Young is the better player than all of those potential other defensive prospects or Tua. And picking Tua first off, let's go ahead and isolate that from the other potential picks people were talking about with Washington. Picking Tua would be a mistake, if only because of how much of a waste of draft capital it would be. Tua Tagovailoa is a great player and should be picked very high. However, they picked Dwayne Haskins last season at 16th overall. We've seen this before. Last season, the Cardinals did the exact same thing, picking Josh Rosen at 9th, and then Kyler Murray first overall the next year. But it's a mistake. It was a mistake last year, even if Kyler Murray was their guy. Wasting, the rookie contract, the amount of value you get from a rookie contract for a quarterback, especially in the middle of the first round, not even a top 10 pick, is crazy compared to, what a franchise quarterback calls for in the NFL now. You just saw Dak Prescott call for a lot of money and get a good bit of money. I think he was franchise tagged, if I recall correctly. You're talking $20+ million for any decent franchise quarterback at least. And if you want a good franchise quarterback, it's much more than that compared to the single-digit $1 million that a rookie contract will net you, especially with a lower pick. So Dwayne Haskins, picking 2 quarterbacks in that way in consecutive years is such a mistake for any team. And because of that, Tua Tagovailoa is not the pick for the Redskins. He's the pick for someone else soon, but it is not the pick for the Redskins. They have to roll with Haskins at least for a couple more years, I think, before they really go try to get a top-tier quarterback in the draft. The other defensive picks, like I said, is kind of a different situation. I think Chase Young's just better than them. Isaiah Simmons is great. Jeff Okudah is great. Derek Brown is great, but Chase Young is just a better player. He's a generational prospect. They're amazing. They should go really early, but Chase Young is just different. Moving on to the Detroit Lions. They're one of the teams that I feel like... Well, two things about the Detroit Lions that make them very different from both the Bengals and the Redskins in the top two picks. First off, the Lions are the first wild card in the way that they could really go and pick anyone. The Lions have the third overall pick mostly because of how many injuries they had last season. They started off actually with a very promising beginning to the season. They started off 2-0-1 when the only undefeated teams left after 3 weeks, and then only lost to the Chiefs by about 5 points. The Chiefs, of course, go on to win the Super Bowl. They end up being a lot better throughout the season. But it's still a very promising beginning of the season. Close loss to Green Bay in week, I think, 6 or week 5. And then they had about 12, 13 starters injured by the end of the season. They lose out after those first, I think, 2 or 3 wins. And they have the third overall pick. It's a very, very bad season for them. However, for a team with a third overall pick, because of the fact that it was mostly due to injuries, they don't have nearly as many holes as the Redskins or the Bengals or even the teams below them, the Giants, the Dolphins, the Chargers do. Specifically the first two. The Chargers are actually more similar to this, more similar to the situation the Lions in their roster. So because of this, the Lions have a lot of freedom. They don't have one pressing need. There is no one generational prospect that should go over any of the others. There's no obvious pick for the Lions. My guess for where they're going to go with this, just because of the situation with their defensive backs, I think there really is one player that stands out above the rest as the right pick, even if he's not the best player on the board. And to me, that is Jeff Okudah, cornerback from Ohio State. The second of 3 Ohio State players picked in the top 3. Many mock drafts have this. And I also agree with many mock drafts. The other interesting point with Detroit, this is the first true, very good trade-down option. Because while Detroit, being the third overall team, is probably going to want Jeff Okudah, they could probably get Jeff Okudah lower in the draft at 5, 6, maybe even as low as 7. They could trade down with a Miami, with an LA, with a Carolina, and let them go get Isaiah Simmons or Tua or whoever they want, and get some great value with mid-tier picks, or even some pretty valuable picks for that trade down of 3 or 4 spots, or 2, 3, or 4 spots. I think this is the first place where you could really see a trade early on in the draft happen. Maybe as late as that third overall pick on draft night. We'll have to see Thursday, of course. But Jeff Okudah, I think, is the player that fits Matt Patricia's kind of scheme with the Detroit Lions the most. He is a defensive head coach. He's kind of he's seen as he has a reputation for being a defensive mastermind as a head coach, but he doesn't really have the pieces in that secondary to show that. And I feel like Jeff Okudah is the one player that is the best at giving Matt Patricia what he wants as head coach with the Lions. They could go pick Isaiah Simmons. I could definitely see that at 3. But I feel like Jeff Okudah, they need a more pure cornerback than what Isaiah Simmons would give them. Moving on to the 4th pick, that is the New York Giants. There are 3 players, sort of, I'll talk about that in a minute. 3 position groups, I guess is the best way to put it, sort of, that the New York Giants, assuming Okudah goes 3, that the New York Giants could pick here. You have the best offensive lineman, or at least whoever they evaluate as the best offensive lineman, the best wide receiver, or Isaiah Simmons. And all 3 make a lot of sense. Isaiah Simmons is a transformative player on that defense, potentially. He probably will be absolutely amazing no matter where he ends up playing, both on the field and in whatever city. But they also just spent a very early pick on Daniel Jones. And I think they need to go get someone that can help Daniel Jones in a lot of ways. And I think as much as a wide receiver would help them a lot here as well, I think they're going to get more value out of getting one of those big four offensive linemen that I talked a lot about in the previous weeks. Of course, the big four, Jedrek Wills, Tristan Wharf, Mekhi Becton, Andrew Thomas. Any four of them could go at this fourth overall pick with the Giants. It's just at this point, I think their pick is going to be whoever they think is the best of those four players. Whatever their scouts decide, their GM decides as the best of those four players. My personal opinion is that the best of those four players is Andrew Thomas. He's the one that should be picked first. He's my first offensive tackle on my board. However, that's not the overwhelming opinion. A lot of people see Andrew Thomas as falling to the fourth offensive tackle, maybe even fifth or sixth, falling to, 11, 12, 13, maybe as late as 16, 17, 18 in the draft. And while I don't think that's going to happen, I do see that his stock is not as high as some of the others. So of the three that often are in this fourth overall pick, I think the one that is the most likely and the one that I think will happen is Jedrek Wills from Alabama. Jedrek Wills is probably is one of the most complete players. I think he and Andrew Thomas will have the best transition into the NFL on day one of the big four. I think Wharf and Becton have a little bit more work to do. Maybe they won't start week one. So I think Wills is a little bit more of a complete prospect than the other two. And he has the stock to go with him to maybe actually be picked at fourth. So I think this pick makes a lot of sense. I think the Giants wouldn't be making a mistake with this, even though I do think Andrew Thomas is the better player. But I think it's a little bit more likely than the Andrew Thomas pick at this point. Then you have the fifth overall pick, the Miami Dolphins. There have been a lot of rumors with what Miami will do with this, but if this is one of those picks where if they make anything other than the obvious choice, I think they're making a mistake. Even if a lot of people are saying that they're the best place for Cam Newton, just as an example for a free agent's landing spot. And I think that's a big mistake from Miami. I think at 5, he probably will be there. I don't think they need to trade up to do this. I think they can go get Tua Tagovailoa. So Adam in the comment section asks, no Simmons. We'll talk about Isaiah Simmons. I think he can. I think there are a lot of places he could end up going. He could go as high as 3. He could go as high as 2, potentially. But ultimately, I think that there are other players that are better for those picks. Isaiah Simmons is an amazing player, and he'll get picked pretty soon. Don't worry. But I feel like Okudah and Wills are better at those positions. So let's talk about Tua Tagovailoa. There's really only one issue with him as a player, as a prospect, and that is his injury report, I guess. Injury status. He's been injured a lot in college. 3 separate times, 3 separate body parts, both of his ankles and his hip. He was out for the last 5 or 6 games of his college career. He declared for the draft, and there are a lot of concerns with his potential injury. How healthy is he going to be going into the NFL? You think the Giants are going to pick him up? I could see that. I could definitely see that. But I feel like they have too much trouble at offensive line, and the players at the top of the offensive line are so valuable that they need to go get whoever they think the best offensive lineman is. But I definitely wouldn't be surprised if Isaiah Simmons got picked at 4 with the Giants. That wouldn't be a huge surprise to me. But Tua Tagovailoa, a lot of people say he has the better talent. If he didn't get injured, he would be the person that would go number 1 overall. Going into the season, both college and the NFL, that was, I guess, the joke among the NFL community, tanking for Tua, trying to get that number 1 overall pick to go pick up Tua Tagovailoa. It ended up being Joe Burrow instead, just because of those injury concerns, but without them, you could argue he's the better prospect, just looking at his entire career. Burrow had 1 great year. Tagovailoa had 1 amazing year, 1 really good year, even before his injury, or before his injury at the very least. So I think he's an elite prospect. I think he should go top 5, and I think he will fall to number 5. The Lions still have a 32-year-old Matt Stafford, and the Redskins and Giants just picked a quarterback last year, in the first round. So I don't think it makes sense for any of them to pick a quarterback. If the Bengals pick Burrow, then Tua should fall to Miami, and they shouldn't have to trade up for him. They might. I could see that, but I don't think they have to. I think he will fall. And I think he'll be a great fit there. I think maybe he sits for the next year, learns under Fitzpatrick for about a year. He can be a serviceable player, serviceable starting quarterback. We saw that last season. Develop Tua, develop him into the next great starting quarterback for Miami. And I think they can have a lot of success there. I think the future is very bright if they make this pick. Moving on to number 6, the Los Angeles Chargers. So this is a big one. And it's a pick that in a lot of ways defines the rest of the entire draft. Because there are 2 picks, I think, 2 potential picks that the Chargers can make. They could either pick Justin Herbert, or they could pick an offensive lineman. Now, again, Isaiah Simmons is still floating on the board, and at this point, you could argue he's a steal. I think he would be a steal outside of the top 5, and whoever ends up getting them will have a steal. And obviously, any player like that could be an option here, but I feel like there are more pressing needs for Los Angeles than just adding to that defense. A defense that, if it wasn't injury-riddled, specifically Derwin James last season, would have been elite. They were elite the season before. They're a great defense. I don't think that's what they need. I think their bigger need is at the offensive line, especially at the top of the value at that pick 6. The best players, there are Isaiah Simmons, a couple of really good defensive linemen, and then the other 3 great offensive tackles that are still on the board. There are so many amazing offensive tackles right at the top of the draft board that missing that opportunity, passing up on that opportunity to pick one of them right here, is a huge mistake for Los Angeles. I think the Chargers would be doing their offensive line and their offense a huge disservice if they did that. Because here's the thing. Their quarterback situation, this is when it comes to, I'll talk about Justin Herbert and potentially Jordan Love, but I've talked about it extensively before. Their quarterback situation, no matter what it is not going to be good going into the next season, unless they trade up with Detroit to go get Tua, which is possible. It's definitely possible. Assuming that doesn't happen, their quarterback situation is they're not going to have a great quarterback. They can't find that in the draft. Because here's the truth, or at least my opinion. Here's the thing. Justin Herbert is not a first-round quarterback. He is not a day 1 starter. I don't see him as that level of talent. I think he'll be fine. I think he can be great. He has that potential. But he is not worth a 16th overall pick. He just isn't. Or 6th overall pick, excuse me. He just is not worth that. If they do pick Herbert at 6, they have to be okay with the fact that their starting quarterback next season is not going to be great. I don't think he would beat out Tyrod Taylor in training camp of his rookie season. I think Tyrod Taylor would be the starting quarterback if they picked Herbert. So my point is, they're not going to have a great starting quarterback next season. Even if they do get Cam Newton, there are doubts there. Even if they do get Jameis Winston, there are a lot of doubts there. So instead of trying to pick that here at 6 with a huge piece of draft capital with that 6th overall pick, I think you go somewhere that's a little bit more solid and go get one of the best offensive linemen in the draft, Andrew Thomas. And again, when I say Andrew Thomas, it could be Mekhi Becton, it could be Jedrek Wills if he falls, it could be Tristan Wharf if he falls. Whoever's there, whoever of the 3 or 4 that are left at this point, they think is best. I think it's Andrew Thomas. I think they pick Andrew Thomas. But it could be any of them. Which one specifically is pretty trivial of those big 4 offensive linemen. I think they're all great, and I think they're all going to be great players in the NFL, even if not day 1 for a couple of them. But not the point here. The point is that it is one of those offensive linemen instead of Justin Herbert. Because here's the thing. After the Los Angeles Chargers, there really aren't any teams in the first round, or there are so few teams at the very least in the first round, that would be looking to actually pick a quarterback. And that fact defines the rest of the draft. If the Chargers get Andrew Thomas or an offensive lineman, that means that one fewer top 10, top 11 team is going to get a great offensive lineman. That means that, and then that team is going to pick somebody else, like a defensive lineman or a linebacker, whoever, and then a team later on isn't going to get the player they want. Every single team from here on out, because I don't think a team in the first round is going to pick a quarterback, except for maybe New England, we'll talk about that later, but that means at least from 7 through 23, the rest of the draft is majorly affected by this one Chargers pick, assuming 1 through 5 go without any real surprises. If the Chargers don't get Justin Herbert, every single team past this loses, or at least a good number of teams lose some value from their draft pick. Well, that's the exception of one team, the 7th overall team, and that's the Carolina Panthers, because there's one player at this point that's still there, who is still at an absolute top 5 pick level. There's no question about it, and that is, of course, excuse me. Ooh, sorry, little bit of a mess up here. Boom. I apologize. And that is, you see it on the screen now, the Carolina Panthers, who can pick, with this mock draft prediction, Isaiah Simmons. It would be amazing value for him to fall to 7, and I think it would happen. This is my true mock draft, this is my true prediction, but it would be great for the Panthers to be able to pick him up. So Adam makes a really interesting point. I'll go ahead and address this. The Chargers would want to trade down if they're picking Herbert. I could see that. If they want to pick Herbert, that would be a very good selection. My initial mock drafts actually, and I'll talk about this later when we get to pick 13, had the Colts picking him at 13, which I think would make more sense for him. But again, I'm not talking about trades. Yeah, the Chargers could definitely be a trade down option. Now, if they do that, they're losing out on that offensive tackle. But if they want Herbert, that would make sense. And they can get a lot of value for that 6th pick. They could get him anywhere in the next 15 picks if they wanted to do that. That can be possible, for sure. And it would be a lot more, I think, justifiable. I think I could see Justin Herbert going at 13 or 15 or 17 or whatever. But I think, I don't know if, that definitely makes sense, but at least for the point of this mock draft, there won't be any trades. So, assuming there aren't any trades, they have to pick at 6. I think this would be better for them. Would it be better for them overall, as opposed to a trade down? I don't know. I think that's a decision for the GM to make. I might actually prefer this just because of how great these 4 offensive linemen are, and I think how much value you lose after the 4 offensive linemen, the big 4, and missing one of those, especially with the rather weak offensive line the Chargers have now. But ultimately, I think either way they'd be okay. I think I do prefer this for the Chargers. I don't know what they will do, but if they're at 6, I don't think they pick Herbert. But let's talk about Isaiah Simmons. Obviously, we've gotten a bit about about Isaiah Simmons potentially going higher, potentially at 4. I could definitely see that. The Giants could pick him there. But if he does fall to 7, whoever gets him, whether it's the Giants, whether it's the Chargers, whether it's the Panthers, whether it's the Lions, whoever it ends up being, they're going to have a great player. Isaiah Simmons is an elite prospect. A truly, truly elite prospect. Oops. Well, I apologize. A little bit of a technical difficulty there. Sorry. Okay, so, a little bit, Isaiah Simmons, gotten sidetracked. Let's talk about him. Isaiah Simmons is great. He has so much versatility. And that's why I don't think he goes at 3 instead of Okudah. He's not that pure corner that Okudah is, but he is the sort of player that you can put anywhere on the defense. He can play linebacker, inside or outside. He can play edge rusher. He can play corner. He can play nickel corner. He can play safety, free or strong. You can put him anywhere on that defense, and he will produce. He will contribute. He's that sort of Swiss Army knife player that so many different defensive coordinators are looking to have that versatility on defense, to have that flexibility to go in different packages whenever they need to. And that is so valuable, especially for a team that just lost their big linebacker, their star linebacker, in the Carolina Panthers. Of course, Luke Kuechly just retired, and what's a better replacement than the best linebacker, quote-unquote, on the draft board than Isaiah Simmons? I listed him as a linebacker. That's the position he went into the combine as, but of course he can play anywhere. He wouldn't really be a Luke Kuechly replacement. He might even be more than that, as great as Kuechly is. He's just a different player, but he is definitely that quality of player. I think he really is that great. And I think the Carolina Panthers would gain a lot if he ended up falling to 7, which I do think is very possible and what I do think ends up happening. So moving on to the 8th overall pick, you probably saw it a little bit earlier because I accidentally messed up. So I'll go ahead and reveal it. The Arizona Cardinals picking Mekhi Becton, offensive tackle from Louisville. And this one, in a lot of ways, I think is a no-brainer. They have the 8th overall pick. One of those really great offensive linemen, one of those big four I've talked about before, is going to fall to them. I don't think they really care. I don't think they care enough between the four to trade up to get a specific one. They're all great. Trading up is not worth it, even if I do think Thomas and Wills are better than Becton and Wharfs. I think Becton and Wharfs are a little bit more raw, whereas Thomas and Wills are a little bit more refined and will start earlier. But they're still going to get so much long-term benefit from Becton that there really is no question to me as to where they need to be picking at 8th overall. It could be Becton, it could be Wharfs, it could be Wills or Thomas if one of them is there. It doesn't really matter to me. This is the pick they should go with. It seems like the pick they're going to go with, and if they do, then they have a very promising future. Kyler Murray, some great wide receiver talent, of course DeAndre Hopkins. I think there's a lot that this team can do in the future if they do the right thing in this draft and make the right pick and go get Mekhi Becton. Moving on to the 9th pick. The 9th pick is the Jacksonville Jaguars. They have a lot of needs. Their defense from a couple of seasons ago, obviously very famous Saxonville, great defensive line, great front seven, has been tarred and feathered over the past few years. It was great in 2017, now we're in 2020, and you've got Yannick Ngakoue, who got franchise tagged, might not even be there himself next season, and no one else from that great defense. Lost Jalen Ramsey, lost Calais Campbell, lost everyone. And because of that, I think they really need to focus on that defense if they're going to have success in this in the future. This is another team that you could make an argument, maybe they want to go get a quarterback, but they have so much value from Gardner Minshew as a, I guess, serviceable starting quarterback. He's not great, but he's so inexpensive that as long as he's okay out there, I think he's worth it. A 6th round contract is nothing. He's being paid absolutely nothing right now. And as long as that's the case and he's playing decent football, I don't think picking a 1st round quarterback is worth it, whether here with their 1st pick or at their 2nd pick at 20th overall. So I don't think that's where they go. So I think they go and get probably defensive BPA, the best defensive player available, to try to just shore up, because the entire defense needs help. The entire defense needs work. And I think the first place they go, the player who I think is the best defensive player on the board, assuming Simmons is gone, assuming Oguta is gone, of course, assuming assuming Young is gone, is Derek Brown from Auburn. The best pure defensive tackle on the board, because Chase Young is more of an edge rusher defensive end. He's an absolute monster. You can go back and watch the LSU game specifically if you want an example of this. Again, a lot of older fans of the show know, South Louisiana LSU fan, watch this game firsthand. The only team that really slowed down LSU's offense, held them to 23 points, 500 yards, but 23 points. Derek Brown was a good reason for that. The LSU had the best offensive line in the nation last year, won that award, and he was still an absolute monster. He was unstoppable. The best defensive tackle on the board, the best defensive tackle in college football last year, and definitely worth a 9th overall pick. He could be that sort of Calais Campbell replacement in a lot of ways. Now, Calais Campbell's a lot older. I don't think he was that great at in his past couple of years, but Derek Brown is that, cornerstone of a defensive line that you can build around. And I think he's definitely worth a 9th overall pick. And I think it's what they should do at this point, and I think it's what they will do. Then moving on to the 10th overall pick, there's one remaining, again, big four, if you want to call him that, offensive lineman left, and the Cleveland Browns need him desperately. They lost both their offensive tackles, and they need to go get a replacement for it. And at this point, I think they will. With the 10th overall pick, I think they select, of course, the one that's left in this mock draft, Tristan Wharf's offensive tackle from Iowa. Wharf's is a solid player. We've talked about all four of them. He's a little bit less refined than the others, but he's still way better than Jones or Cleveland or Jackson or anyone else that you could pick from this offensive line class. They need a replacement for one of their tackles. They need a great one. He can probably start within year one. And I think it's a no-brainer at this 10th overall pick. Moving on to 11, we have the New York Giants. Just lost Robbie Anderson. Lots of holes on this roster, but I feel like they're actually somewhat close to completing a team and completing a competitive team. Sam Darnold will be on his 4th year on his contract here. I think he's been serviceable. I think he is improving. And I think they need to give him a number one weapon to truly go out there and be a franchise quarterback that they think he can and will be. And there are two wide receivers that I think are the two big selections they could go get at this point at 11. Of course, CeeDee Lamb and Jerry Jeudy. At this point, it's kind of a toss-up. I think Jerry Jeudy is the better player. I think he has the higher floor, But a lot of people think that CeeDee Lamb is the more likely to go first. So, in this mock draft, CeeDee Lamb goes first. A wide receiver at Oklahoma. Great player. One of the most elusive wide receivers I've really ever seen. Some of the plays he made against the likes of Texas and really most of the Big 12 this past season were insane. He was the number one target or one of the top targets for, 3 straight playoff starting quarterbacks in Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray, both of which winning the Heisman, and then Jalen Hurts this past season. 3 NFL quarterbacks. Hurts isn't going to go in the first round, but he'll go later on. He'll be in the NFL this next season. The other 2 first overall quarterbacks, the other 2 Heisman quarterbacks, he was a large reason for that. He was kind of that common denominator between them. And you can see why just any of his film. Again, the most elusive wide receiver I've maybe ever seen with my own eyes. He can catch, he can run, he can do absolutely everything. He is a do-it-all wide receiver, and he can be that number one option for Sam Darnold in the future. I think that is what he will be, and I think it's a very good pick for the Giants, and I think it's what they will end up doing. Moving on to number 12, the Las Vegas Raiders, which is still difficult for me to say at this point. They are actually in a very similar need. They also need a wide receiver badly, and they probably are content with, at this point, just picking the one that is not there when the Jets make their pick within this mock draft, hypothetical situation, and I think they end up getting the other big one, Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy is a great player. Again, I think he has the higher floor, maybe the lower ceiling, but I think he can also be that number one wide receiver in the future in the NFL and do absolutely everything that Derek Carr or Marcus Mariota, I guess, would need him to do. He can be that. They didn't really have that last season, and now they do. They tried to get that with Antonio Brown. They lost it. But Jerry Jeudy, I think, is a more stable, great wide receiver to be a cornerstone of that core. So moving on to number 13 overall. So you have the San Francisco 49ers, and I think they're in one of the most unique positions in the draft. And I think this is where, at the time, draft psychology might have an influence on their pick. I talked extensively over the past few weeks about how big that trade to Forrest Buckner for the 13th overall pick was for the 49ers for getting a wide receiver. This wide receiver class is amazing. It's super deep. They could go, get the best wide receiver on the board. I talked about it a lot. Jumping over Denver, which was the big thing. And getting Henry Ruggs, which was the big thing. And while I think that could definitely happen, keep in mind the last two picks we just saw. We just saw, at 11th overall, CeeDee Lamb, best wide receiver on the board, go. Then we saw Jerry Jeudy, second best wide receiver on the board, go. And we know, while Henry Ruggs is the third best, there's a little bit of a gap between 2 and 3. I feel like that might have a psychological effect on San Francisco. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe they can overlook that and still go get Henry Ruggs. But that's the third straight wide receiver to go off the board. Usually the last team to get a pick of the same position on a position run like this gets the worst value. And that would be the case with the 49ers. So I think they might have to ask, is there someone on the board that is more valuable to them at this 13th overall pick? And that's a very good question. They have a few interesting needs. They are desperately needing a lot of players at defensive back, both corner and safety. They have a light need at offensive line. Of course, they have a lot of need at wide receiver. But then you have to ask the question, what is the single player that is going to be the most valuable for them next season? Is that Henry Ruggs? Maybe. Maybe it is. But is it someone to replace, say, Richard Sherman? Their cornerback core is weak. But the cornerbacks at this point, the second best cornerback on the board who's had a meteoric rise over this past month or so since the Combine, I guess 2 months, is C.J. Henderson. He's the best cornerback on the board left after Okudah gets picked. But it's also a little bit of a reach to go get him at 13. I think he's more of a mid-teens, late-teens pick. So the question is, do they go get C.J. Henderson, or do they go get Henry Ruggs? This is a question that they might not have to ask if, say, Tristan Wharf is on the board, if the LA Chargers don't get an offensive lineman. If the LA Chargers get Justin Herbert, then there's still an offensive lineman left on this board, unless the Jets or Raiders get one instead of Lamb or Jeudy. If that happens, they can just get Lamb or Jeudy. If the Jets or Raiders don't get an offensive lineman, they can go get an offensive lineman that's worth the 13th overall pick. But because the Chargers in this mock draft picked Andrew Thomas, that's not an option. Instead, they have to either settle for a little bit of a reach at wide receiver, settle for a little bit of a reach at corner, or settle for a little bit of a reach at offensive line. And with there being so many offensive linemen and wide receivers picked, I think the most likely of those scenarios, the one that they're going to go ahead and end up going with, is the reach at cornerback. So I think they end up getting C.J. Henderson. But this is definitely one of those big question marks within this mock draft. And they're one of the teams that are most heavily affected by the Los Angeles Chargers' choice at 6th overall. It might not be Henderson. It might be Ezra Cleveland or Austin Jackson or Josh Jones, whoever they think is the best offensive lineman in the next year. It might be Henry Ruggs. But I think maybe the most likely of them, I don't know if it's the best pick for them in this situation, but the most likely pick in this situation for them, I think, is C.J. Henderson, the cornerback from Florida. He had a great combine. That was really the big thing. He jumped over Diggs and Johnson and Fulton, leaped over them in the cornerback board. Now is number 2, and deservingly so. And I think he ends up going here, even if it's maybe not the best decision for the 49ers. Definitely, if this ends up happening, they're a trade-down option. Go get some more value for the 13th overall pick and still get the player that they want later on. Moving on to 14, the Buccaneers are in an interesting situation. They're also in a place where a lot of their needs maybe are a little bit of a reach, but I feel like they can get one player here that is worth the 14th overall pick, even if he fell off a little bit after the Combine, and that is a defensive tackle from South Carolina, Javon Kinlaw. He had a monster Senior Bowl, then he got injured and left, but it's still a great Senior Bowl. Didn't have an amazing Combine, but Javon Kinlaw was great, and I think he is still worth a top 15 pick. So picking him out at 14 I think is fine. And they need to shore up that defensive line a little bit. Maybe you could argue that maybe they need to shore up their offensive line more, but at this point, I feel like picking up an offensive lineman would be too much of a reach at 14. I think you need to wait to the late teens until an offensive lineman is really worth it, which means, again, another potential trade-down partner to a team that maybe doesn't need an offensive lineman, or doesn't need doesn't need an offensive lineman as much in those late teens. Maybe someone like the Dallas Cowboys or the Jaguars potentially, or the Eagles potentially. Or the Eagles potentially. Who could trade up and maybe go get that defensive player that they need more, like Javon Kinlaw. Who knows? But in this mock draft, Javon Kinlaw, I think, is the pick. Moving on to 15, the Broncos, again, in this mock draft, caught a break, sweating bullets at that 13th pick, probably. When the 49ers go get Henderson instead of Ruggs, they still have their man, even after the probably scary for them DeForest Buckner trade, and the Broncos can get Henry Ruggs. Great player. I think worth it at 15. I think he'd be worth it at 13, maybe a little bit of a reach, but either way, worth it at 15. Speedster, I think someone that would help Drew Lock a lot with that monster arm of his. I think it's someone that the Broncos need, that great weapon to pair with Drew Lock, I think is absolutely desperately need. Yeah, I could see that. Adam, they wanting to trade up, they could definitely be a trade-up partner. Because I think the value at 21, if they want to trade to 11-15, that's one of those teams that would want to trade with the 49ers, or maybe the Buccaneers, to go get maybe Ruggs. If they can get to like 11 or 12 to go get Judy or Lamb, that's also possible too. I could definitely see that happening. But again, this mock draft is a no-trade mock draft. So, but in the situation, the Broncos, get their player, get Henry Ruggs, and they're probably satisfied with the rest of the draft at that point. Moving on to number 16, the Atlanta Falcons. This is where mock drafts get very deviant. Many, many different ways a mock draft can go at this point. And I don't think there's any one right option. The Falcons are a team that I think their biggest need is coaching. Their biggest need isn't anyone specifically on the field. I think Matt Ryan is still fine. I think their wide receiver core is still great. The running back, they need running back, but they can get that later on in the draft with like a Clyde Edwards-Helaire, a Jonathan Taylor, someone in the second or third round. So in the first round, there's no real obvious pick. So I think they go BPA again. And I think at this point, the best player available is not obvious. I think the middle of this first round is where the most question marks are. Because I don't think there are that many players that are obviously better than others. And this is where we're going to get probably a not very popular pick within my mock draft. A lot of people mock this guy a lot lower than 16. But I think that he's a bit underrated. I think he's very underrated, actually. He had a not great mock draft, but he still had a great... his physical attributes are great. He had a not great combine, Physical attributes were great. His last season with Penn State was great. And I think that is Yetur Gross-Matos. And I might be mispronouncing that. I probably am mispronouncing that. But doesn't change the quality of player. He's a great player. Maybe it's a stretch. Maybe it's a reach. But I feel like he is the best player for the Falcons left on the board. Maybe there are other players that are more valuable for this position, but this is really where you start getting questions of the great players are gone, those top 15 picks, and then you start getting the players that have question marks, that are controversial, that maybe shouldn't be going this high, and I think Gross-Matos is one of those players. But I think his upside is so high that he could go here. I think he would deservedly go here. The Falcons, like I said, you can spend as many first-round picks on that defense as you want. You need a new defensive coordinator. You need a new head coach at this point. But I think he's a great player, and I feel like he can help this team a lot. So moving on to 17, the Dallas Cowboys. Not a very obvious pick for a long time in free agency, or before free agency. This is a team that didn't have many obvious holes. But then free agency happened, and they lost Byron Jones, and the hole became very obvious. Cornerback. This is one of the picks that when I was making this mock draft, I had to think about for a long time. Because this, more than the Falcons, more than the Buccaneers, more than the 49ers, is a tough pick. The pick that I'm specifically making for the Cowboys in this mock is difficult. Because it's a bit of a reach. Maybe people would argue not as much of a reach as Gross-Matos, but I think that's because people are underrating Gross-Matos. But he's a reach. And I think it's the pick they end up making. They're really desperate at cornerback at this point, after they lost Byron Jones. So they need defensive back, but I think the defensive backs at this point aren't really mid-first-round picks. So whoever it is, whether it's McKinney, Delpit, Diggs, or Fulton, those are the big four really at this point left, I think it would end up being a reach. So do they do that, or do they go closer to BPA? I'm not sure, but I think the pick they end up making is that cornerback just because of how big of a need it is. So I think they end up getting Trevon Diggs. I do rate him a little bit higher than Christian Fulton. And I think for a long time I mocked CJ Henderson, but he rose so high into the board that I feel like he could go earlier than 17. And if he does, I think Diggs is their replacement. Again, they could go Fulton, they could go Johnson from, I think it's TCU, later if they want to instead, but I feel like Diggs is the player at this point. He's the best replacement they have for Byron Jones at this point. I don't think they're going to get someone else in free agency, and they desperately need to fill that hole in any way possible. And this is the player that I feel like is going to be the best at that for the Cowboys. Moving on to the 18th overall pick, the Miami Dolphins. I talked about this last week with their needs. They spent a lot of money on free agency on the defense. And the defense looks actually very interesting. Byron Jones is one of those examples. But I think because of that, I think they're going to spend their first-round picks this season on the offense to build around Tua Tagovailoa. So because of that, I think they go get... It was the worst offensive line in football last season. So I think they go get the best offensive lineman left on the board. I think around 18 is where it starts becoming worth it again after the big four are gone to start looking at those offensive linemen. Your Austin Jacksons, your Josh Jones, your Ezra Clevelands of the world. And so I think this is where this starts. And it could go a lot of ways. I think they do end up picking one of those three players here. Maybe you could wait to 26 and get one of them and then get somebody else that's more valuable. But I feel like that's the best player to get for them. And of those three, the one I rate highly and the one I think is consistently rated most highly is Austin Jackson. Oh, I apologize. Boom, Austin Jackson. His film is a little bit concerning, but his physical traits, his combine were both great. And because of that, I think he does rise up to 18. I think he can be a big help for that offensive line for Miami and contribute a lot to helping Tua Tagovailoa in the future. I think this is more of a project pick. He might not start year one, but he only needs to start once Tua starts playing, and I don't think Tua starts year one. So this is a future pick. I think Miami is a team for future success, not this next season's success. And I think this is a pick that would benefit that future a lot. Moving on to the 19th overall pick, the Las Vegas Raiders get their second pick of the first round. And they have a lot of needs. Obviously, in this mock they drafted excuse me, I blanked for a second. They drafted Jerry Jeudy. So they helped out their wide receiver core. I think they're going to go and help out their defensive back core a bit here. It was pretty weak last season, needed a lot of help, and I think the player that helps them the most at this point is Xavier Mckinney. Again, this is the point in the draft where there are a lot of question marks with any player that you pick, but I think McKinney is the best for the Raiders, and I think he does help them the most. Moving on to the 20th overall pick, another team that makes their second pick of their draft, and that is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I said this with their first pick at 9. Both 9 and 20, I think they go pick great players for their defense. They picked Derek Brown in this mock at 9, and I think they go pick at 20th Kenneth Murray, linebacker from Oklahoma. And Kenneth Murray, there are some conflicting reports about where he should really be going in the draft, as high as 15, 16, 17, as low as late first round, early second. I think he is closer to that first range. I think he's more deserving of being closer to that first range. I think he was the cornerstone of that, the captain of that Oklahoma defense last season that was pretty well improved from Oklahoma defenses of previous seasons. And I think he's that sort of player that the Jaguars need. Both he and Derek Brown down the middle of that defense, middle linebacker, defensive tackle, are what they need to build a defense for the future with the Jaguars. Maybe around Gardner Minshew as a team. But either way, if they're going to be winning games with Gardner Minshew, they need a solid defense for him to play complementary football with. And I feel like Kenneth Murray is the best way to do that for them at pick 20. Moving on to the 21st pick, and if this is the Adam that I think it is, then this is probably the pick he's most interested in, who I think is going to the Philadelphia Eagles. So, the Philadelphia Eagles are in an interesting spot. They have a few needs. They shored up cornerback pretty well, getting Darius Slay, and somebody else I don't remember, but sorry. So that's not as much of a need at this point. Their big need is wide receiver. Had a lot of injuries last season, but they also lost Alshon Jeffrey, and they need a lot at wide receiver. And while I don't know if it's the best pick for value's sake, because you can probably get about 80% of any wide receiver you get past Lambs, Judy, Ruggs at the first round, and those three in the first round, you can get 80% of any receiver you get other than them within the first round in later rounds. I feel like that is where they end up going. And it still makes sense. I think that is what they end up doing, and I think it's still good for them. So it raises the question, what wide receiver do I think helps Carson Wentz the most in Philadelphia? And that's a good question. Obviously, assuming Ruggs, Judy, and Lamb are all gone in this mock draft, they are. I think they end up going with Justin Jefferson. Now, is that the right pick? I don't know. I talked about this before. Justin Jefferson is a first-round talent, but because of how great so many wide receivers are in this draft, I don't know if he should go round one, given the class, because you could probably get 70% of them in maybe the fourth round or the third round in this draft, and that's great value. But the Eagles, this is the sort of draft class where the Eagles are going to get someone now, and they're going to go get someone like KJ Hill or Edwards from South Carolina in like the third, fourth, fifth round. There are 30 legitimately great wide receivers in this class, and they're going to get at least 2 of them, if not 3, within this draft class. And they should, because they need to. They need to not be starting J.J. Arcega-Whiteside as, I think he's, promising young talent maybe, but not a starting wide receiver right now. They need to be doing that. They need to pick a wide receiver here, and I think they will. And I think Justin Jefferson is the one that fits the best at this point. I think, first off, he's really an all-around talent. He can play anywhere. Again, LSU fans know exactly just how good he is. One of the big targets for Joe Burrow this past season. And he can play anywhere. He can do pretty much anything. He's not a huge wide receiver, but he can do whatever you need, slot, outside, do whatever, and he can be very productive. And I feel like that's what Carson Wentz needs. Needs a reliable outside threat to help bolster that offense. So moving on to the number 22 overall pick, the Minnesota Vikings, of course, trading the Buffalo Bills. They are, as opposed to the Eagles, who were desperate at cornerback and have become much less desperate at cornerback, the Vikings are very desperate at cornerback because they lost all 3 of their big talents. Number 1, number 2, and their number 3, and their nickel corner, all gone. And that is a huge problem for them. They're desperate at cornerback. If this were a different kind of cornerback class where they could go get 2 legitimate first-round talents at 22 and 25, they have 2 very close picks, they might go do that if there were 2 that were worth it. Unfortunately, there aren't 2 that are worth it, and I think they're going to go get someone else at cornerback, and someone else with that second pick instead. But with the New Orleans Saints, who are also desperately in need of a cornerback at 24 between their 2 picks, they go get the one I think true first-round talent at cornerback left, and they go get Christian Fulton. Cornerback at LSU, I think he's late-round talent. I think he's late first-round talent, and I think he's great. He's that player. He's going to have to play week 1 with Minnesota if he gets picked here. And that impacts a lot. It impacts a big pick, and I'll talk about it in just a little bit. But Christian Fulton, I think, goes around here no matter what. I don't think he goes later than 24 to the Saints, but I think he goes 22 in this mock draft, where Diggs doesn't fall and Henderson doesn't fall. And the Vikings need a cornerback desperately. They don't really have a single starting cornerback, on the roster, and they need two of them, at least. And I think Christian Fulton can provide that for the Vikings. Moving on to the New England Patriots. This is one of those big picks. 6 through 22, 7 through 22, I guess you could say, all were impacted by the fact that the Chargers in this mock draft did not pick Justin Herbert. This is the next place where a Justin Herbert or a Jordan Love can get picked. So, do they? Maybe. I think that's the ultimate question. I think we'll find out on Thursday, because I don't think both of them go in the top 10 picks. I think one of them falls to the Patriots, because the Patriots are one of those teams that need a quarterback desperately. They lost Tom Brady, of course. They could go sign Winston or Newton still, but even if they do, they probably want a quarterback for the future. Is that Jarrett Stidham? I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong, but ultimately, this is a legitimate consideration for Bill Belichick to go do. He might want to go out there and get a quarterback at his first-round pick. Because who else does he play? Does he play Jarrett Stidham? I don't think so. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. I wouldn't be shocked if he did, but I don't know if that's a great idea for him or for him. So, if he doesn't pick Jordan Love and Justin Herbert, who does he pick? Because ultimately, as much as maybe it's the right pick for the Patriots at 23, I don't think that's what Bill Belichick will do. He doesn't draft quarterbacks in the first round. He doesn't draft in the first round much at all. So, would he? Maybe, but I don't think that's what he ends up doing. So if they don't pick quarterback, what do they do instead? Do they pick wide receiver? Again, I don't think so, because they just spent a first-round pick on a wide receiver last season in N'Keal Harry. Yeah, it's a need, of course. They only have one consistent target on the entire team, other than, I guess, James White, if you want to count him, in Julian Edelman. But, again, I don't think that's what they do. I don't think they pick the same position twice in a row in the first round. So instead, I think they go to the defense. They lost 2 outside linebackers, so I think they're pretty desperate at outside linebacker. Because of that, I think they go get an outside linebacker in... Excuse me. I apologize. I misread my selections. They go get a pass rusher. I apologize. In H.J. Espinosa. I'll go ahead and explain why I did this in just a second. So, okay. I apologize. I made a mistake. So, the New Orleans Saints, I'm going to have picking Patrick Queen. I have like an outline with the picks not where you can see. And so, I saw Patrick Queen, and I misread it on the outline as the New England Patriots pick, so I made a mistake. I apologize. No, but this pick makes a lot of sense, too. They could go back. So let me go ahead and talk about this, though. They could go get Patrick Queen instead. Because they do need linebackers desperately. However, they need really everything on the front seven other than middle linebacker. They have Dante Hightower, but outside of that, the rest of that front seven is kind of weak. The secondary is great, but the rest of the front seven is kind of weak. So it's a question of, do they get AJ Espinosa? Do they get Patrick Queen? Do they get someone else, like Forney Jennings or a different defensive lineman? They could. But ultimately, I think the best player on the board of those picks is AJ Espinosa. He has plummeted in draft stock over the past month or so. Not a very good combine, not great numbers, and that hurts him a lot. But ultimately, he's still worth a mid to late first round pick. And I think he's a better player than Patrick Queen. I think he's more worth a first round pick than Patrick Queen. And I think they will pick him over Patrick Queen, even if they just lost 2 linebackers, including former Super Bowl champion Kyle Van Noy. So moving on to the New Orleans Saints. You've seen this pick for a little bit. I apologize. Patrick Queen. So I think the number one player they're looking for is Tristan Fulton. Tristan Fulton, in this draft, gets picked by the Vikings instead. And so, as much as they need a cornerback, picking a cornerback at 24 would be a reach. Too big of a reach to pick. They have other needs on the defense than just cornerback to reach that far into the second round talent in order to get a cornerback. So I think instead, they also need linebackers. They also lost linebackers in free agency. And they also need someone like this. Now, I don't think Patrick Queen's a first-round talent. I've said this extensively over the past month. In the LSU episode, in the evaluation episode, I don't think Patrick Queen's a first-round talent. That being said, a lot of people do. And I think a team is going to reach for him. I think he's better than the best cornerback on the board, maybe, at this point. But I don't think he's worth the 24th overall pick. But I think they ultimately do pick him there. Moving on to 25. Again, the Minnesota Vikings. If they pick a cornerback at 22, they're going to pick probably a wide receiver to try to replace Stephon Diggs at 25. And I think the wide receiver that best is suited to do that on the board is Denzel Mims. Maybe this is too early for Mims, but I think he's worth this talent. I don't think he would fall to their second-round pick, and I think they want him too badly to let him pass at 25. He's a phenomenal player, really a do-it-all wide receiver. He can catch, he can run routes, he can do everything. He's super fast. Sub 4.40 with his speed and his hands and his route running. Really a complete prospect that just doesn't get the same flash as a lot of these other players that are going to get picked in the first round. But I think he's worth it, and I think he's a suitable Stephon Diggs replacement. Be that number 2 wide receiver behind Adam Thielen, and I think he fits very well with the Vikings. Moving on to number 26, the Miami Dolphins. So the Miami Dolphins, in this mock, they picked Tua, they picked an offensive lineman at 18, so I think they go at wide receiver, get a number 2 option for Devontae Parker, and they go get not an amazing wide receiver, but I think a wide receiver that fits well with them, complimentary, very tall, T. Higgins. He goes up, gets those 50-50 balls. Tua can go throw it to him. Great weapon for Tua in the future. I think he needs to develop a little bit. I think he's a little bit overrated. But at 26, I think he makes sense with the Dolphins. Moving on to the number 27 pick, the Seattle Seahawks. This is where, this is the point in the draft where you start getting players that probably are going to get picked in the second round in a lot of these mocks. There are so many options in the difference in skill between the 27th best player in the draft and the 35th, let's just say, best player in the draft is so small that they could really go anywhere with this, and especially a team like the Seahawks that doesn't have super obvious needs. They could really go in a lot of different directions. They could go offensive tackle, they could go defensive tackle, they could go linebacker, they could go safety, they could go really wherever. There's outside of like running back, quarterback, wide receiver, they could really go anywhere. I think they ultimately end up getting Raekwon Davis with this 27th pick, but is he better than an offensive lineman? Is he better than a safety? Is he better than a linebacker? Maybe not. I don't know. This is where it's really difficult to predict exactly what the Seahawks want, exactly who they rate as a better player. But I think he would make a lot of sense for them, especially, this is the big thing, especially if Jadeveon Clowney goes somewhere else. If he leaves. Because that's the big question. If he re-signs with Seattle, then this probably doesn't happen. But that's not what most people within Seattle are saying. Most people are predicting that the Seahawks are going to lose Jadeveon Clowney in free agency. They haven't signed yet. Seems that he probably will not be returning this next season. If that happens, I think they go get who they think is the best defensive tackle on the board at this point. And with Espinoza, who's really more of an edge rusher, but still gone, and with Gross Matos, also kind of more of a defensive lineman, gone, I think they think the best defensive tackle at this point is Raekwon Davis, and they go pick him. Moving on to pick number 28, the Baltimore Ravens. this is where I think a lot of people are mocking Kenneth Murray at this point. But I think Kenneth Murray ends up going a lot earlier than that, in this mock 20, of course. So, that leaves a lot of questions with what the Ravens want to do. And I think there are two different routes they could go. Because they have maybe the best roster in the NFL. They have not many holes. Them, 49ers, maybe the Chiefs, you could argue. Great roster, so they could really go BPA. But I feel like they go somewhere else with this. Because, and maybe this is BPA, a lot of people say he should be picked earlier than this. I think he's a little overrated. We'll talk about him in a second. But the Baltimore Ravens need to keep Lamar Jackson very safe. They had an amazing offensive line last season, but they need to keep having an amazing offensive line, a position that doesn't have a very long shelf life, if they want to keep Lamar Jackson as healthy as possible for as long as possible. He can only take so many hits. His legs can only run for so long. And because of that, I think they go get the best offensive lineman left on the board, Josh Jones. I don't think he's a day one starter, which is why I think he fits perfectly with Baltimore. And because of that, he can go be a future protector when one of these offensive linemen go and get a mega deal somewhere else. Baltimore can let that happen and keep Lamar and this great offensive line and this great offensive scheme around for as long as they can. Moving on to 29, the Tennessee Titans need to keep that defense very solid. They need another piece in that secondary, and because of that, I think they get the remaining defensive back that is a first-round talent in my eyes, in Grant Delpit. And I think that puts another team, the San Francisco 49ers, in an interesting situation later in the draft. But we'll talk about that in a couple of picks. The Grant Delpit, I think, makes a lot of sense for Tennessee. They need a safety or a corner very badly. They need to bolster that secondary, and I think Delpit is the best player left on the board in order to do that. Moving on to the 30th overall pick, the Green Bay Packers. 30 is a really weird spot for Green Bay. I talked about it last week. They pick too late for their level of roster in my eyes. I don't think that Green Bay is the third best team in the league or has the third best roster in the league, but they have the third to last first overall pick. And a lot of the players that I think would help Green Bay a lot, Kenneth Murray, maybe Patrick Queen, but Denzel Mims, Justin Jefferson, Josh Jones, they're all going to be gone by the time you get to 30. So I think they're left with a player that's just not as good as those players. I think the player they end up getting, because they're desperately in need of a linebacker, Christian Kirksey is not reliable, and they still need a second inside linebacker. I think that player is Forney Jennings. Another player that gets mocked a lot lower than this often, but I think it's the player that makes the most sense for Green Bay at this point if Kenneth Murray is gone. I mean, if you're a Packers fan, cross fingers that he's still there, but I don't think it happens. I don't think he falls past 28 at Baltimore. And if that happens, and all the great wide receivers and offensive linemen they could get here are gone, I think that Forney Jennings makes a lot of sense at 30. Moving on to the San Francisco 49ers. So they have three really big needs. Those are offensive line, safety or cornerback, and wide receiver. And they already helped out the cornerback situation. Excuse me. The secondary situation with their 13th overall pick. So they either go offensive line or wide receiver. And that's an interesting situation. Because of the scheme that the 49ers run, they're a very heavy run team, one of the biggest run teams in the nation, in the league. I think they actually go offensive line here, because I think the drop-off between Edward Cleveland, who I think is their pick, and the next best offensive lineman, I think that is bigger than the drop-off between whatever wide receiver they would get here, whether it's Jalen Reagor, KJ Hamler, Brandon Ayuk, Laviska Shenault, whoever that would end up being, theoretically. I think the gap between them and whoever they could get in the second round is a lot smaller than the gap between Ezra Cleveland, the best offensive lineman left on the board, and the next best offensive lineman, or the offensive linemen that would fall to the second round for them. I don't think Ezra Cleveland is the best player on the board left, but I think he is the person to pick at this point for the 49ers because of who is left. And then finally, the Kansas City Chiefs. I said a couple of weeks ago that they're the one team that could pick a running back with this 32nd overall pick. And I think they're a team that definitely could be trading down because there's no obvious need, and the few needs they have aren't that valuable at 32nd. They need to bolster that defense. I think they go BPA, best player available on the defensive side of the football, which is unfortunate because I think most of the next best players are offensive players, specifically running backs and wide receivers. So I think at 32, they end up getting, I think, the player that's the most valuable for them at this position, and that is Jaylen Johnson, a cornerback from Utah, at 32nd overall to finish the first round. They just need to bolster that secondary more. I think that's the one big need they have. Help out Tyrann Mathieu, help out that secondary, help out that defense. That was a lot better than you would have expected after about halfway through the season. That was the big reason they had their Super Bowl, really more than the offense. The offense was great, but that defensive improvement is what led them to what they do now. And, defending the Super Bowl going into the season. And I think if they want to defend it successfully, they need to keep bolstering that defense. So I think Jaylen Johnson is the pick over someone like a DeAndre Swift. So that is the first round. Let me know what you think. Comments in the comment section below. I know, obviously, everyone's mock draft is different, but that is my thought. Depending on how the draft goes, I might do an episode next week about reviewing the draft and talking about it. If not, I might just have a yearly review episode to finish off Terrier Talk. I think I'll end up having two separate episodes. But either way, that is it. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope to see you next week. Same time, same channel. I will see you then.